Good morning. It's good to be here. It's good to be with you all. And yes, Andy, that has a lot to do with where we will end up at the end of the lesson this morning. So thank you for that. That was great. If you're thinking that this lesson is not for you because maybe you don't feel like you fall in the young category, that's not true. A couple of things, a couple of notes here on who can benefit from this. Parents can really benefit from this, not only to strengthen our own faith, but also as we kind of think a little bit deeper about how faith is developed, then we can give our children those experiences, those parts of life that will help them. And grandparents kind of the same way. As you grandparents, kind of envy you guys. You have the opportunity to spoil your grandkids, but really the role that God has for grandparents is to assist in their upbringing. You're not the primary caregiver, which is great, but you get to just put those extra little nuggets in here and there along the way and give them those extra benefits and experiences that will help them develop their faith. I want to put this picture up there because it reminds me of my childhood. I didn't explain the previous picture. Hold up. This is a picture of training. You hold the tree in the position, the sapling, the young tree, in the position that it should be in until it grows big enough to maintain that direction on its own. That's really what child training is all about. So, as we explore these ideas of how to grow faith, how to develop faith, how to make your faith your own this morning, remember this picture, parents, that in the middle of the broken glass and the mess and the fits and the tantrums, that you are holding those children in a certain path that will benefit them long term and give them a foundation so that when these guy wires are taken off, they still grow that same way. You are helping them practice faith before they even know what it is. So the better you understand that process, the better you can help them. All right, so here's the dad, maybe granddad, holding on to the back of the bicycle seat just like my dad did. You guys are probably, most of you, familiar with learning to ride a bike. And it's a painful process. For me, it was a really painful process because I said these words, I can do it. And so the father then lets go of the back of the bicycle at some point. Well, first of all, I said I can't do it, right? And then he encouraged me, and then I said I could do it. At some point, you let go of the bicycle, and there's a crash, scraped knees, blood, Band-Aids. And then what happens next? Get back on the bicycle. You do it all over again. And you keep doing that until you know how to ride the bike. And so here the father, grandfather is holding onto the bicycle and helping this child, in our analogy, have his own faith. Is he going to mess up? Guaranteed. And then we let go, they fail, get back on the bike, and continue having faith in their lives. Okay. Faith when we're young. I really appreciate the reading this morning. I think it's interesting that Eli had to tell Samuel God was talking to him. Did you catch that? Samuel didn't know God had a message for him. He didn't know God was talking to him. He didn't know God had a plan for his life. Does that sound familiar, young people, at all? I know it sounds familiar to me when I was young. Samuel actually had to be told, you need to listen to God. I wrote this. It says, if you're ignoring God, it's hard to build your faith. as we talk about making your faith your own, as we talk about building faith, coming closer to God, it's like this mysterious thing that you've never done and you don't know how to do, kind of like riding a bicycle. And maybe this sounds harsh if you're ignoring God, but sometimes we're not ignoring God on purpose, right? Was Samuel, the boy Samuel, ignoring God on purpose? He wasn't. He just didn't recognize his voice. A lot of times that's true in our lives. God is trying to get through to us, right? God is putting circumstances in place. He's putting people in place. He put His word in our lives. And yet, we don't recognize His voice. We haven't yet learned how to interpret the experiences that we go through to understand and recognize God's hand there in our lives. So, one thing that came up as I researched for this lesson is if you have questions, find the answers. A lot of times we feel like, and it's not just young people, is it, guys? It's all of us. We feel like, I really don't understand what's being talked about right now. I have a question. Maybe I partially understand, but I want to understand better. Maybe I wish I knew why they did that at church. Why don't we do this? There's any question that you are legitimately seeking an answer to, that you are honestly trying to find, is a good question. And so ask the questions. That's part of finding your own faith, if you think about it. If you don't know the answer and you don't ask the question and then you don't know the answer and then next week you don't know the answer, it's going to be hard to find the answers and find your faith. So, ask questions. I'm going to have a lot of techniques, and a lot of these I'm going to have to just kind of mention and go on for time's sake. So, it might be worth it to take notes or go back and watch the video or something like that. Another technique, you can imagine young Samuel there. God speaks to him, and he's afraid to tell Eli what God said. You remember that? He's afraid to tell Eli because God said, your sons are going to die and bad things are going to happen to your family. He didn't want to give that message to Eli. So now here Samuel is. God has spoken through Samuel. Samuel's a child. We don't know what age he was, but he's young. How do you develop that relationship with the God who has delivered a big message through you? Even Samuel might have felt lost at the time. Let's look at James chapter 4. Some of these verses you may have heard before, but I want to look at them in the light of an answer of how to find our own faith. In James chapter 4 and verse 8, it says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded." He goes on, "Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up." Draw close to God. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. You know that's a promise? Do you realize that's a promise? You cannot draw near to God. You cannot seek Him, which is the next phrase up there, without Him blessing you. If you are trying to find Him, He will come and make Himself known to you. Now, Hebrews 11 and verse 6. Here in the Hall of Faith, where we're going to spend some more time in this lesson, verse 6 merely says, "Without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." Who does God reward? Those who diligently seek Him. The Hebrew writer puts this out as a principle of God that we can latch onto, that we can hang our hats on, that we can count on. If we seek him diligently, he will reward us. Well, what does that mean? What if we seek him casually? What if we wait for him to come find us? What if we're busy and we use a little bit of our leftover time to find God? Is that the kind of seeking that is being described here in this verse? Is that the kind of seeking that God will reward? As you make your faith your own, these are things you have to be serious about. It's not just one sliver of the pie of what you can use your time for. It has to be your purpose in life. When you make your faith your own, you have to seek him, draw near to him, and be really serious about that effort. One thing that's very helpful, and one thing as I talk to young people that they repeatedly mention is, I had this example. I saw this person as I was growing up. I saw that my parents, maybe somebody at church, maybe I didn't grow up at the church, maybe I knew someone. And so these examples are extremely important. Paul said, imitate me just as I imitate Christ, 1 Corinthians 11:1. So follow good examples. Find some good examples to follow. Maybe you see someone who does one thing really well. Well, follow that example. Maybe they do something else poorly. Don't follow that part, right? Take the good, leave the bad. Follow good examples. We're going to get more into the meat of this lesson, and while we're still here in Hebrews 11, we're going to start looking at Abraham. Remember, God called him to go to a land that he would show him, right? And he went out not knowing where he was going. This really reflects our journey of finding our own faith. We don't always know where this road is going to end up, and it's a bit unsettling, actually. If I give my life to God, I might not ever have any fun again. If I give my life to God, I might just have to serve everybody else and kind of cease to have my own identity and existence. Now, none of these are true, okay, but sometimes we feel this way. And sometimes we don't even know what we're afraid of, but there's just this hesitancy to go all in. Or maybe we're just busy. Abraham went all in. He packed everything up. He took his family with him. He set out on a journey. Was he afraid? I know he was afraid. He told us he was afraid. That's why he lied about Sarah being just his sister instead of his half-sister and his wife. He said, "For there is no fear of God in this land, and they will kill me for her sake." Somebody's going to kill me and take my wife. Was he afraid? He was very afraid. You don't have to not be afraid in order to be a Christian. But you do have to set out trusting God, even though we don't always know where we're going. Let's see here. So he obeyed when he was called. You know, we're called. We're called through the gospel. God's word is here. It's always calling us. If we'll read it, we can find the answers in there. We talked about Abraham not knowing where he was going. It says, by faith he dwelt in a land of promise as in a foreign country. If we're going to build our own faith, we're going to have to consider ourselves to be in a foreign country. I remember Jessica and I went to Chile for 2 weeks. And in some ways, it was the longest 2 weeks of my life. I've been in other parts of the world, and there was much more English spoken in Africa than in Chile. It's kind of funny. So we were down there, and we had an interpreter, but it wasn't like a daily, like he interpreted everything. It was like he interpreted my sermons, and then we kind of had to get along best we could the rest of the time. Now, there were conversations that we had with that brother along the way, but a lot of the time he was having his own conversations with the people that we were among. So it was an aloneness that was just so different from anything I'd ever felt. We were with people, and yet so very isolated from them. We live in this culture that we've grown up in, and we feel at home in it, and yet there's an element of being very different and out of place for the Christian. Abraham felt this firsthand naturally. We feel it spiritually. And it's sometimes hard for us to remember we're not of this world. If you're going to follow God, you have to come to grips with this idea. You have to be okay with the idea that we're different, and it's uncomfortable, and it's weird. There is some weirdness because we're not being driven by the same motivators as the culture around us. And so, although we talk like the people around us, look like the people around us, and blend into the culture, we have very similar ideas, there is a definite difference. It's like we're in a foreign country. Okay. They were dwelling in tents. I don't know anything that would really make this sink home that they were just in a temporary place more than not even building a house. They were heirs with him of the same promise. Talks about Isaac and Jacob, his descendants, heirs with him of the same promise. And it says, oh, that's for later. Never mind. All right. So we've covered some walk of Abraham and his walk of faith as he began to develop his faith. Do you know that God put those circumstances in his life specifically so that he would grow in his faith? I want to break it down a little bit different way. Think about Timothy as opposed to, and the path that he took to God as opposed to Paul and the Philippian jailer. And I want to bring this up because we all have a different path to come to God. Timothy, we remember that his mother, grandmother, both had a pivotal role in instilling his faith into him. At a young age, the apostle comes through, preaches Jesus. He's obedient to the gospel. And then he goes preaching around with Paul. So he's kind of like this young man who grows up in the church and never really goes astray. He's a faithful, follower of God. And that was really different from Paul's journey. Remember Paul? Even though he was of the strictest sect of the Jews, even though he knew the law inside and out and sat at the feet of the most learned teacher of his day, he really had a crisis at some point, didn't he? Remember, he was on the road to Damascus to kill more Christians. That's where he was going. That's what he was doing. And he was serving God on his own terms. He had it all figured out. There was no way that Jesus was the Messiah. And then Jesus strikes him blind. He has to get somebody to lead him by the hand. He had a crisis. Can you imagine if you suddenly lost your eyesight, even if you didn't get struck blind on the road to Damascus? He had life all figured out. And yet at some point, he got stopped cold in his tracks. Look at the Philippian jailer. He's a lot different from Paul. He didn't grow up knowing the Scripture. He didn't have faith instilled in him at a young age. He wasn't living a life that he thought was right and following God with all his heart. He wasn't deceiving himself that he was following God. But one night, he was as good as dead. One night, he woke up. The prison doors had opened, and he knew that this was it. Because when the prisoners escape, the life of the guard is forfeit. If he didn't kill himself, they would do it for him, and he knew which one he would prefer. And then there's a voice that calls out from the darkness. Don't harm yourself. We're all still here. You're what? The prisoners didn't run away when the doors opened? He calls for a light. He wants to see what's going on. And he knew immediately that it was God who had saved his life that night. It wasn't Paul and Silas. They didn't keep the prisoners from escaping. They didn't open the prison doors. But he knew that the same God that Paul and Silas had been singing to and praying to, that gave them strength to get through their trials, the same God he had probably heard, same Jesus he had heard about Paul preaching in the city of Philippi, that was the God that he needed because he has saved his life. I love asking people how they came to Jesus. I don't know what's going on with my voice right now. I'm just going to push through that, all right? I love asking people about their stories because you hear, well, I grew up in the church. You know, I was pretty much always faithful. I had some questions at one point, and I studied and asked teachers and got through that, and here I am today. You ask other people, one of my friends, he said that he woke up and he was in like a ditch, some kind of on the side, like actually on the side of the road kind of ditch. And he was trying, in spite of his substance abuse, to get home. I don't know if he was hungover, drunk, high. I don't know exactly. I don't remember the story. And he couldn't do it. He could not physically make it out of the ditch. He kept falling and he just didn't have control over his limbs. And he knew at that moment he was going to die if he didn't get some help and quit the stuff he was doing. And he realized he needed Jesus to help him with that. Everybody has a different story. You come from a different path. It's always different. But there's always an element where you realize at some point, I have got to follow God. If you have doubts you're dealing with, get some answers. There are all kinds of people here who would love to help you with questions about God and the Bible. If you don't yet realize that you need God in your life, then ask people for their stories. There are a bunch of Christians in this church. It's pretty cool. Ask around, get people's stories, find out what happened to them. Why did they become Christians? Talk to people out in the world. Kind of find out how their lives are going and what's going on with them. You will find that we have blessings in Christianity as far as knowing who we are and where we're going that you don't get out in the world. So as you realize then your need to follow God, then as you walk through more and more years of your life, you realize just how much you owe to God and how great and loving He is. As you have bosses that are awful to work for and just make your life miserable for weeks, months, years on end, you realize what an awesome boss God is. As you have people disappoint you in your life and let you down, you realize that God doesn't do that. He's always there for you. As you disappoint other people and you're not there for them, you realize that God is still there and forgiving you even though you've let Him down. And so you get to know who He is, and you build a relationship with God over the years. This is part of making your faith your own. You know what I mean? You can't really have faith without knowing who God is and having a relationship with Him. And as you walk through your life, you get to know Him better. And the closer your heart is tied to God over the years, the more that drives you to turn around and give back to Him, to study, to be loyal to Him, to pursue an even deeper relationship with this awesome deity. Think about Matthew 6:21. For where your heart is, I knew I'd mess it up. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? So wherever you invest, that's where your loyalty will lie. As you seek to know God, as you seek Him diligently, and as you draw near to Him, as you read the words of our Lord and Savior, as you read the history of His people in the Old Testament, as you get to know Him through the experiences and how He works in your life, then that will drive you on to remain faithful. So, in other words, invest in the things of God. As a young person, especially a young adult, as you get out on your own in your life, you start making more and more of your own decisions, just because nobody else is there to do it for you. You start providing for yourself. And as you take the reins of your day-to-day life in your hands, you kind of continue doing the same things you have been doing in the past. Ask yourself, as you live life, why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Why am I making these decisions? And as you explore that, even if it's like, why am I coming to church? As you kind of really dig in and deep and think about that, and you figure out, well, I'm going to church because of who God is. I'm going to church because God said to go to church. I'm going to church because I have a hope of something better to come. And as you find those answers for yourself, as you look inside yourself, examine yourself with an introspective attitude, then you will build your faith just by getting your own answers to these questions. All right. As you ask yourself, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? You will eventually come to one of those questions that I certainly dealt with as a young person. I kind of think most people do. Maybe I'm wrong. The question is, who am I? Really? Like, I know my name, I know my parents, I know where I came from, my childhood, but who am I going to be in the future? Who am I now? Who do I want to be? Be intentional in that. Don't just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, I don't really know. I guess I'll find out when I get there. Really think about who it is that you want to be and go be that person. If you're seeking to establish your own faith, if you're seeking to know God, if you're deciding you want to be a Christian, hang on to that with every fiber of your being, draw near to Him and find out what that looks like for you. You know, when you're about 9 years old, life is pretty simple. You want to play with your friends, maybe play some games on the computer. Even if my kids get in trouble, like right before they go to bed, that's happened a few times, they're still asleep pretty quickly, and you walk in there, there is no trouble on their faces. They're just peacefully sleeping. Nothing's on their heart. They're not worried. They're not bothered. I'm in there in the other room like thinking. So when you're 9 years old, life is pretty simple. But as you get older, you begin to have some dreams and some goals. Getting the driver's license comes on the horizon. You want to get a car. You want to go hang out with your friends more. You can drive, so you want somewhere to drive to. Have some independence. And then maybe you're interested in having a boyfriend, girlfriend, right? And so that begins to take up some of your time. Maybe you go to school, you get a job, you start living your own life, you get that apartment, you become independent. There's always something new on the horizon, right, as we get older. At some point, you get married maybe, you have kids, or you don't. And so you're doing all the things, you know what I mean? Like you're doing all the things of life. Maybe you start your retirement account. I missed something I had written down, but that's all right. Oh, buying a house. That was it. It's funny I forgot that one. Anyway, I'd like to do that myself right now, actually. So you're doing all the things and you're checking all the boxes. I'm going to check the buying a house eventually. But at some point, it kind of becomes empty. Like it's just another thing to do and achieve and get and have, whatever. And so as you get older, you begin to consider, who am I a little bit more deeply, right? You get down to the nitty-gritty. Ecclesiastes talks about this, right? Solomon did it all. You like music? He had his own private bands that played for him. He had his own private gourmet chefs, fixed his food every day. If it came to eating and drinking, he had the best. He had it all. Lifestyle had nothing on Solomon, right? Like the magazine, the different shows, that kind of stuff. He said, I tried folly, I tried madness, I tried mirth, right? He was wise, but he also tried being foolish. What is the resounding, repeating phrase in Ecclesiastes? All is vanity. All of this stuff is meaningless. And so at that point, you can begin to look deeper. Who am I? What is my life all about? Why am I here? And you can begin with your end goal in mind. If you decided, I want to be a Christian, I want to go to heaven one day, with that end goal in mind, then you can begin to focus on that and kind of weed out the less important stuff. When I was in school, during that time of my life, I'd been taught that I need to prepare myself as a young person, prepare myself to make a living, because I should be able to, provide for my family. Guys, that's a right teaching. That's not a wrong teaching. Those are correct ideas, right? So I put myself into school 100%. I went to school. I went to work. I slept on my bed. It's about the only time I was in my apartment because I was busy. I was doing the stuff. Now, during this time of my life, I was going to church. I was living, a good life. I certainly had my struggles, but I was faithful to God. But I didn't put God first. I didn't look at that time in my life and say, okay, what could I be doing for God at school? What could I be doing for God at church? Maybe there's some folks that need my help at church. I even invited people over to my apartment, right? Be hospitable, all that stuff, people from church. But still, in my heart, I was making the main focus of my life preparing to provide for my family physically. And I was missing out on living for God. I was doing all the stuff. I wasn't unfaithful. I wasn't living a life of rampant sin, but I wasn't living for God either. I was doing the stuff, but I hadn't given my heart to Him. I hadn't put Him on the throne and in the number one slot in my life. Does that make sense? I hope I'm communicating. And I would really desperately love for you guys not to follow in my path in that. I would love for you to have God at the center focus in your life. Yes, go to school if that's what you're doing. Yes, get a job. But realize that this physical life is just an opportunity for us to meet people and talk to people and be an example to them. I appreciate what Andy Cantrell said during the meeting about his journey as well. And he was talking about it wasn't enough just to be a good example. He had to talk about Jesus a little bit as well. And so it takes both parts, right? You have to live for Jesus. You can't just talk the talk. You can't just walk the walk. You have to talk and walk, That's the deal. Now, everyone, again, is at a different place in their lives. But the takeaway point here is make God your everything and let everything else fit in around that. Don't give up. I want to talk a little bit. Oh, that's next. Okay, so don't give up. Scott, could you scroll down a little bit? I know I lost you there. Thank you, brother. Just up a little bit. Number 4. We want number 4. Ah, perfect. Yeah, okay. 1 Kings 19 and verse 10 is Elijah. And what has happened here is with Elijah, he's had the showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Remember that? They drenched the altar. They drenched the sacrifice. They drenched the wood. And he challenges the prophets of Baal, call down fire from heaven. And it doesn't work, and it doesn't work. Hours go by. They cut themselves. They cry out, and it doesn't work. And then he prays a simple prayer to God. Fire comes down from heaven, not only lights the sacrifice, totally consumes it, consumes the wood, burns the stones, evaporates the water. What a great victory. And then Jezebel sends him a message on his way out of town, so to speak. She said, I will kill you deader than you killed my prophets of Baal. That's a paraphrase. That's not exactly what it says. But she threatens his life, and he takes it to heart. He leaves. He gets as far away as he can get. And then he gets even farther away with the strength that the food that the angels gives him. He's in a cave. God comes to him, talks to him. This is Elijah's response. So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Those are the words of a man who wants to quit, if I've ever heard anybody wanting to quit. He says, I'm as good as dead. Your people have rejected you. I'm the only guy left. God corrects him. He says, no, I've got 7,000 who haven't yet bowed the knee to Baal. There are others, and here are 3 missions for you to accomplish with the rest of your time as a prophet for me. He goes on and does awesome, great things for God. It's after that he trains Elisha to be prophet in his stead. Be like Elijah. Don't give up. Don't quit. No matter how bad things get. When we talk about faith, when we're young, we talk about making our faith our own. I want to say something about expectations, and I'll probably repeat this a lot in the coming months, because I've come to really place a lot of importance on what we expect. If we expect that when we become Christians, that then we'll be happy all the time. Our problems will take care of themselves and evaporate, and life will be good. We will be disappointed, and you will fall away. We have to set proper expectations, okay? If we expect trials and hard work, then we'll have proper expectations. Difficult times will come, but we were expecting that. We'll lean on God for help. We'll get in the Scripture and study, write down verses, ask people for help, confess our faults one to another, and get through those difficult times. And we knew that was coming anyway. If we expect hard work, if we expect that it's not going to be easy to find our own faith, to make our faith our own, then when it's difficult, when we plateau on our faith, when we kind of get lukewarm, when we have doubts, when brethren disappoint us, when there are problems in the church, and it's hard work, we will realize, well, that's what I expected. God told me that was going to happen. God told me that was coming, and I'm ready for it because I knew it would come sooner or later. to close our lesson out, let's look back in Hebrews 11. We read about Abraham beginning in verse 8. It says in verse 10, after talking about being heirs of the promise, it says in verse 10, "For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Let's look down at verse 13. That's where it is, verse 13. Speaking of Abraham and others who lived faithful lives, it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland." Hold your finger there, we'll come back. They seek a homeland. If you want to have strong faith, you have to keep your eyes on the prize. You have to be focused on what comes after. You hear lots of lessons. Average lifetime, I think I looked it up, is around 76 years for men and women put together. That's not very long. I know when I was like 13, that seemed like forever, right? But the more you live, the faster life goes, and the more you realize you're not going to get everything done that you want to get done before you die. This is not going to happen. You remember I went with my dad to help clean up the property in Tennessee. You know where Dad is? He's gone, and it's not finished yet. We're not going to get everything done that we want to. We're not going to... That's all I have to say on it. I'm out. But they seek a homeland. If we're seeking a homeland and we don't finish all of our projects, this really bugs me because I like to finish my projects, and I don't always. It's okay, right? Because we went home. We will receive the homeland. We read there in verse 10, he waited for the city with foundations, right? I want you to key in on that word waited. If you want to have the patience of Job, sometimes you have to wait and just live through life. You have to be faithful in the meantime, as the books put it. Verse 13, not having received the promises. Yes, we know about the promises. They're out there, but they're not right here, right now for us either. They embraced the promises. They held on tightly to them. They cherished them. It was the most important thing in their lives. The thing that would happen after they were dead was the most important thing during their lifetimes. There were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. We talked about this earlier. When we live that way, with a view of eternity instead of a view of today, we declare plainly, we're looking for a different home. That's the message we give to the people around us. We give them hope of heaven to come and a threat of hell after judgment because they can see how we're living and that we're looking forward to that. Now, here's where we're going to look back at the text. In chapter 11, you look back at verse 15, it says, "And truly if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return." That's you. Sitting there, trying to build your faith, trying to become more faithful, trying to figure your life out. You have the opportunity to go back to the world. You have the opportunity to let go of your faith in God, to be too busy, to put God on the back burner. You have that opportunity. What's going to keep that from happening? Seeking the homeland. Verse 16 says, "But now they desire a better," that is a heavenly country. "Therefore God is not ashamed to be their God, to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Here in the slide background, I know it's obscured by the words, and that's intentional. But as we walk the way God wants us to walk, there it is, what we find is that we can see the steps of Jesus in front of us more clearly. As you live the same types of crises that the Bible characters had, and God helps you out as well. As you go through lukewarm times in your faith and then realize how much God means to you, you can see his feet, almost see his feet making those prints that you're following in your life in front of you. We don't see it physically, of course. It's a journey that we walk through in life. And so this is how you make your faith your own. I want to summarize really quickly. You learn by doing, making mistakes, scraping your knees when you fall off your bicycle, learning from those mistakes and doing better. There are going to be some failures. That's all right. Just learn from them. You get closer to God by seeking him in everything that you do. You get to know him better by listening and talking to him. I forgot to say this earlier. If you signed up for a dating service, because we're going to assume because you're not married, and you look through the profiles and you see someone who's really interesting, think, well, you know what? I believe I'd like to get to know them better. And you never send them a message. You never talk to them. You never contact them. How far is that relationship going to go? Now, is that going to go pretty well? No. What if you start talking to them and you talk and you tell them about yourself and you tell them about what you like and what you think, and you continue telling them what you think, and you have more information for them, and you never stop to listen, they're going to eventually get the idea that you don't really care about them. You just want somebody to talk to. And the other hand, the opposite would be true as well. If you always invite them to tell you about themselves and ask questions and you just do all the listening and none of the talking, that's no good in a relationship either, is it? With God, as we build our relationship, we have to read his word and listen to what he has to tell us. If we're going to build our faith, we've got to listen to him train us in our faith. And we've got to talk to him. We've got to pray to him. He's told us to cast all of our care on him. 1 Peter 5:7. He's told us that we're going to need his help to ask for help. He's showed us how to pray, and we have to hear and listen in order to have that relationship with him. When you get to know him better, you want to experience more of his care, concern, mercy, love, more of his reassurance in your life, more of his goodness, rightness, light, strength, joy, and peace in your life. That's where faith leads us. And so this drives a Christian to seek him and be loyal to him more and more. If you're here this morning and you know your life is not right with God, you know that you need to come to him. Maybe you need stronger faith and you want help with that. Maybe you've sinned and you need to make that right with God. We'd love to help you. If we can help you this morning, please come as we stand and sing.